The instructor, Kellen Roas, scoffed at the concept of human tenacity. Then the tempest of the Deathworld descended. Roas, a precision-minded instructor, favored precise lessons, drills that concluded punctually, debriefings that fit succinctly on a single screen, and cadets who demonstrated foreseeable weaknesses. His experience spanned 3 military campaigns and 2 peacekeeping missions, and he exuded self-assurance much like others wore their sidearms, conspicuously and prepared. The Academy had assigned him to Field Exercise 12 on Kestrel 4, a perilous celestial body utilized for authentic training, as it unfailingly penalized errors without needing imitation. Kestrel 4 was classified as a death world by several regulatory bodies. Its atmosphere was breathable, yet harsh, its terrain constantly shifting, and its weather completely unpredictable. This was precisely why the Academy chose it. Roas stood at the edge of the landing zone, a tablet in one hand, a faint smirk playing on his lips. 30 cadets, in mixed formations, clad in field suits and laden with packs, were arranged before him, their helmets reflecting the pale sky. Behind them, the dropship idled, its ramp lowered. Roas paced in front of them. "Your objective," he announced, "is to traverse from this location to the extraction marker, 40 kilometers east. You have 2 days. You are to construct shelters, manage your provisions, maintain communication, and ensure your team's survival." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "This is not a race," he added. "It is an assessment of competence." A few cadets subtly straightened their postures. Roas tapped his tablet, projecting a weather graph into the air. "The forecast," he declared, "indicates moderate winds, cold nights, and no significant fronts anticipated." His gaze then shifted toward the human contingent. 2 males stood within the formation, both in unadorned gear with no discernible augmentations. One was tall and broad-shouldered, with closely cropped hair and an unwavering stare. His name tag identified him as Mason Carter. The other, leaner, possessed calm eyes and a resolute jawline, as if he had long since determined to conserve his words. His tag read, Luke Navarro. Roas had reviewed their dossiers, high endurance scores, significant pain tolerance, and strong completion rates in previous exercises. The Academy frequently lauded humans as inherently designed for hardship. Roas had heard the anecdotes: humans maintaining combat effectiveness despite injuries, humans holding positions without rest, humans surviving conditions that incapacitated others. However, he had also witnessed humans fail like any other species when circumstances turned dire. He stopped before Mason and inclined his head. "Human endurance," Roas stated, his voice loud enough for the entire line to hear. "The fabled myth." A few cadets exchanged sidelong glances. Roas smiled. "I have perused the reports. I have viewed the ancient footage. Humans delight in convincing themselves they are extraordinary." Mason remained impassive, and Luke did not flinch. Roas continued, "Out here, endurance is not a legend. It is a matter of logistics. It is heat management. It is shelter. It is meticulous planning. Should you believe that obstinacy can substitute for preparation, you are destined for a painful education." A Vesri cadet snorted in agreement. Roas allowed his smile to broaden into a brief laugh. "It's a charming narrative," he remarked. "The indomitable human." He looked at Mason again. "Just try not to bleed all over my evaluation forms." Mason replied in a flat tone, "Yes, sir." Roas, appearing content, turned away. He bore no animosity towards humans. He simply abhorred myths, as they fostered carelessness in cadets. He raised his hand. "Move out!" he commanded. The formation dissolved into teams. Each team carried a beacon, a navigation unit, and a limited supply of provisions, including water filters, ration packs, 2 thermal sheets, and a compact shelter kit that could be assembled into a low dome. Rowers followed behind, with 2 assistant instructors, observing their spacing and pace. The landscape beyond the landing zone was an expanse of dark scrubland and fragmented rock, with scattered clumps of sharp grass. The ground was riddled with shallow depressions that could easily cause an ankle injury if one wasn't vigilant. The initial hours progressed smoothly. Teams established a consistent pace. Packs shifted. Cadets breathed heavily, but maintained control. Mason and Luke had been deliberately assigned to different teams. The Academy sought to determine if humans enhanced group survival or merely their own. Mason's team operated with quiet efficiency. He adjusted a smaller cadet's straps without being asked and indicated a safe path around a treacherous slope. He spoke little. Luke's team progressed faster, but Luke prevented exhaustion by enforcing breaks before anyone felt the need to request one. Rowers observed both, his earlier amusement persisting. They were competent, as were many species. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather low on the western horizon. Rowers checked his tablet. The forecast still showed no approaching front. He frowned slightly. The air pressure shifted in a way he could sense in his ears. Kestrel 4 paid no heed to forecasts. He made a mental note to expedite shelter construction that night. They reached the designated rest site, a shallow ravine dotted with scattered boulders. Rowers called a halt. "Shelters up," he ordered. 2 hours, then rest cycle. Cadets moved swiftly, unrolling kits, securing stakes, and layering thermal sheets. Rowers moved between teams, inspecting knots and sealing techniques. Mason's team had their dome erected early, low profile, and reinforced with stones. Luke's team positioned theirs behind a natural windbreak and dug a shallow trench to divert runoff. Rowers nodded, despite himself. Then he heard it. A distant, low, constant sound, like a powerful engine operating far away. Several cadets looked up. The clouds in the west were no longer mere clouds. They formed a colossal wall. Rowers stared at it, then at his slate. The forecast graph momentarily froze, then updated. Severe front, wind escalation, electrostatic particulate storm, impact and debris risk. His mouth went dry. That storm was not supposed to be here. It was approaching rapidly, too rapidly. Assistant Instructor Sav hurried over, her voice taut. "We need to retreat to the dropship." Roas looked at the sky. They were too far now. They wouldn't outrun it. He made a decision that felt textbook correct, but wrong in his gut. "Hold shelters," he commanded. "Reinforce low profile. Everyone inside in 5. Cadets scrambled. The first gust struck before the last team had sealed their dome. It came from the west, like a violent slap. The ravine filled with dust. Stones clattered. A shelter pole snapped with a sharp crack. Then the storm arrived, not as mere wind, but as an overwhelming force. The air turned brown and deafening. Grit hammered against fabric and visors. Larger debris struck the boulders with heavy impacts. Rowers shouted orders that no one could hear. The shelters buckled one by one. Anchors ripped free. Fabric tore. Poles bent. A dome lifted, tumbled, and vanished into the dust. A cadet screamed over the comms. Rowers saw figures stumbling in the open, thrown off their feet by gusts sufficiently strong to lift an adult body. His plan was obliterated in seconds. Shelter was gone. Forecasts were irrelevant. The exercise had devolved into a genuine survival event. Through the chaos, he noticed Mason Carter moving, not aimlessly, but with clear intent. Head lowered, one arm hooked around a smaller cadet, dragging him behind a boulder. Luke Navarro was doing the same on the opposite side of the ravine, pulling a fallen vestry upright and compelling him to crawl. Roas stood in the open for a moment too long, his slate useless in his hand, and realized that the very myth he had ridiculed was about to become the sole factor that mattered. The Deathworld storm struck, and the humans did not yield. The storm obliterated all sense of distance. What had been a ravine transformed into a swirling torrent of grit and noise. Visibility dwindled to arm's length. The wind didn't howl, it pressed, ceaselessly and heavily, as if the planet itself bore down upon them. Roas attempted to issue commands through his comm. Static was his only reply. The signal flickered on and off, fragments of panic and truncated words bleeding through. He tasted dust inside his helmet. A dark shape collided with him, sending him crashing down, his shoulder impacting stone. Intense pain flared. His slate skidded away, disappearing into the brown haze. He struggled to his feet, but immediately lost his balance again. This was no longer a drill. This was not something he could regulate or correct. He saw Mason again, closer now, moving diagonally across the wind rather than directly against it. Mason had one hand gripping a cadet's harness and the other pressed against the ground, using the line of boulders as a guide. Roas, with chilling clarity, realized something profoundly significant. The humans were not attempting to hold their position, they were relocating. Luke Navarro materialized from the dust on the far side, gesturing with his arm instead of using comms. He pointed toward the ravine wall, where a narrow fissure in the stone formed a partial overhang. It was not a shelter in the academic sense, it was cover. Luke thrust 2 cadets into it, then turned back into the storm without a moment's hesitation. Roas watched him disappear and felt something constrict in his chest. He forced himself to crawl toward the overhang, using his hands and knees, knowing that to stand meant being knocked flat again. A cadet, wide-eyed and trembling, collided with him. Roas seized the cadet's suit and pulled him close. "Follow the rock!" he bellowed, aware his words would be swallowed by the wind. He pointed instead. The cadet nodded and began to crawl. By the time Roas reached the overhang, Mason was already there, braced against the stone, holding another cadet in place, while Luke packed loose rubble into the gap to narrow the opening. They were silent. They didn't need to communicate. They were constructing something that would endure, if only for a short while. Another shelter fragment struck nearby and disintegrated. Luke looked at Roas through his visor and made a sharp downward motion with his hand. "Get low!" Roas obeyed without conscious thought. The storm intensified. Small debris transformed into heavier impacts. The rock above them vibrated. Dust streamed in through every crevice. A cadet began to sob, a high, broken sound echoing over the comms. Mason reached over and gripped the cadet's shoulder firmly, not gently, not cruelly. The sobbing ceased. Minutes passed, or perhaps only seconds. Time lost all meaning in the deafening din. The overhang held, but barely. Wind funneled through the gap, threatening to rip them out like unsecured cargo. Luke shifted position and wedged his pack into the opening, using his own body to prevent it from being torn away. Roas observed a trickle of blood emerge as Luke's glove snagged on the rock, but Luke paid it no mind. Another cadet tried to rise, Mason firmly pulled him back down, shaking his head once in a slow, resolute gesture for him to stay. Roas grasped the situation. The humans weren't merely enduring the tempest, they were orchestrating their response to it. They meticulously observed the wind's rhythm, advancing only during lulls, conserving their vitality and mastering their fear. They relegated pain to an insignificant backdrop. Roas had imparted such theories before, yet he had never witnessed their implementation under genuine duress. The storm raged on, exceeding any duration Roas had ever known. When its ferocity finally began to wane, it didn't recede subtly. Rather, it diminished gust by gust, much like a hand gradually loosening its hold. Luke was the first to venture into the calmer air, calling out in a prone position before signaling the all clear. Mason followed, then individually assisted the others. Roas was the last. As he emerged, his muscles quivered, and his confidence seemed to have dissipated somewhere far behind him. The terrain was unrecognizable. Shelters had vanished, equipment lay strewn or interred, and the ravine was half clogged with debris. The designated extraction point remained 40 kilometers distant, and dusk was descending. Roas stood, breathing heavily, and finally regarded Mason and Luke, not as mere cadets, but as the sole reason anyone was still alive. He started to speak, then stopped. There was no lesson he could impart at this moment, only one he needed to internalize. The storm's aftermath wasn't dramatically destructive. That was the insidious aspect. No fires, no craters, just subtle alterations that transformed simple movement into a trial of judgment. The ravine floor was now masked by a shifting layer of dust and stones, rendering once stable ground perilously unstable, with every step threatening a slide. Roas attempted to stand upright, but nearly tumbled again. Mason wordlessly steadied his arm, guiding him back into a crouch. Luke was already sifting through the scattered gear, assessing its usability. He shook his head once, then twice. Shelter kits ruined, one water filter cracked, 2 ration packs missing, communications still unreliable. Night was rapidly approaching. Roas felt the weight of responsibility settle within him. This was his exercise. His decision had led them to this predicament. He compelled himself to speak, maintaining an even tone. "We need to consolidate and reassess." Luke looked at him, his visor obscured by dust. "We need to move." Roas hesitated. "In this terrain?" Mason interjected, calmly and directly. "If we stop, we freeze. The temperature drop is imminent." Roas checked his suit display. The external temperature was already plummeting faster than anticipated. The storm had leached heat from the ground. Night on Kestrel 4 was brutal, even on a favorable day. He nodded once. "Luke, lead." It was then that Roas realized something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer instructing, he was following. Luke took the lead, not because of his speed, but because he scrutinized the ground as if it might betray him, testing each step before committing his weight. Mason remained at the rear, counting heads, adjusting packs, and instigating brakes before anyone completely collapsed. Roas moved in the middle, offering assistance where he could, absorbing more in silence than he ever had from reports. They did not head directly for the extraction marker. Luke angled them slightly north, tracing a ridge of darker stone that would retain warmth longer after sunset. "Basalt," he stated when Roas glanced his way. "Better than dust." The group progressed slowly. A Vesri cadet stumbled, falling hard. Mason was instantly there, hauling him up, swiftly and expertly checking his joints. "Can you walk?" Mason inquired. The cadet nodded, jaw clenched. Then walk, Mason stated. Lean on me. No encouragement, no reassurance, just a directive. As night fell, the wind returned in brief, sharp gusts, not powerful enough to knock them down, but sufficient to sap their warmth. The sky cleared just enough for the stars to burn with cold, stark brilliance. They discovered a shallow depression near a rock face that offered some protection from the fiercest winds. Luke halted, raising a hand. "We stop here," he declared. Roas surveyed their surroundings. No shelter, no cover beyond stone and shadow. Luke retrieved the remaining thermal sheets and carefully distributed them, layering them not as blankets, but as windbreaks, wedged between rocks and packs. Mason instructed the cadets to sit back-to-back in pairs, sharing body heat, enforcing stillness. Roas observed their methodical efficiency and felt a pang of something akin to shame. He had scoffed earlier, dismissing this as mere folklore. The humans were not theatrical. They were supremely effective under conditions where efficiency was paramount. Hours dissolved into fragments. Someone vomited from the combined stress and cold. Mason cleaned it without a word. Another began to tremble uncontrollably. Luke adjusted their position and guided their breathing until the tremors ceased. Roas remained awake, observing, listening, feeling the slow burn in his muscles and the ache in his joints. He realized the humans were suffering too. They simply processed it as an anticipated input rather than an emergency. Near dawn, the wind abated again. Luke scanned the horizon and nodded. "Another push," he announced. "Then we rest." They moved as the light reappeared, grey and diffused. The extraction marker finally emerged into view by mid-morning. A tall signal mast, half buried in dust, but still operational. A few cadets offered weak laughs upon seeing it. Roas did not. He felt only immense relief and a profound sense of re-evaluation. They reached the marker and activated the beacon. The dropship's response was almost instantaneous. "Extraction inbound." Roas slumped against a rock, allowing himself to sit. Mason crouched nearby, breathing heavily now that the urgent need for action had passed. Luke removed his helmet and wiped his face, leaving streaks of dust and the blood from where the stone had cut him earlier. Roas looked at both of them. "I was wrong," he stated quietly. Neither human replied immediately. Then Mason spoke, not unkindly. "Storms do not care what you believe, sir." Luke added, "We just keep moving." Roas nodded. He had no counter-arguments left, only understanding. The myth had never been about endurance as a spectacle. It had been about persistence when plans faltered. And Kestrel 4 had taught him that lesson unequivocally. The dropship descended slowly and cautiously, its engines battling the thin, unpredictable winds that still scoured the ground. When the ramp lowered, the medical teams moved swiftly, efficiently, and quietly. They assessed the cadets in order of severity, tagging injuries, distributing heat packs, and loading stretchers. No one protested, no one boasted. They were too exhausted. Instructor Kellen Roas stood near the extraction marker, watching his cadets board. Some limped, some leaned on each other. All of them were alive. That fact settled heavily in his chest. As Mason Carter approached the ramp, a medic attempted to stop him. "You are bleeding," she said, pointing to his forearm. Mason looked down, surprised, as if the cut had only just manifested. "Yeah, guess I am." "Sit," she commanded. He complied without complaint. Luke Navarro followed, his helmet tucked under his arm. He paused when he reached Roas. "You coming?" Luke inquired. Roas realized he was still standing in the dust, hands empty, utterly useless. Yes, he said, I am. Inside the dropship, the noise was softer, controlled, the kind of sound that signified systems were functioning again. Cadets slumped into seats. Some immediately closed their eyes, others stared blankly. Roas remained standing until the last one was secured. Only then did he sit. The flight back to the Academy outpost was silent, save for medical readouts and the engine's hum. No one desired a debriefing yet. Words would offer no solace. When they landed, daylight had fully returned. Kestrel 4 appeared calm again, almost benign, as if the storm had been a minor inconvenience rather than a lesson etched in pain and fortitude. Roas now knew better. The formal debriefing occurred 2 days later. A sterile room, dry air, crisp uniforms. The cadets sat straighter, but an underlying intensity lingered. Something had altered in their attentiveness. Roas stood at the front of the room and activated the recorder. This is the final assessment for Field Exercise 12, he announced. He paused. Instructor failure, he continued. Primary. A few cadets looked up in surprise. Roas did not soften his words. I dismissed environmental risk based on forecast reliability. I relied on doctrine designed for cooperative terrain. I underestimated adaptive endurance. His gaze shifted to Mason and Luke, seated apart, both quiet. I treated human resilience as exaggeration, Roas admitted. I laughed. No one laughed now. Roas took a breath. When the storm destroyed every shelter and every plan, 2 cadets transitioned from compliance to survival, exhibiting leadership without instruction. He turned slightly toward the display and brought up still images captured from suit cameras during the storm. Not dramatic ones, just fleeting moments. A hand clasping a harness, a body wedged against stone, a thermal sheet repurposed as a wind baffle. These are not heroic acts, Roas declared. They are practical ones. He looked back at the room. Human endurance is not about remaining still and suffering. It is about movement when stopping feels safer. It is about adaptation when structure fails. It is about continuing when the exercise ceases to be one. A cadet raised a hand. Sir, why did the humans not collapse like the rest of us? Roas answered honestly. They wanted to. They simply treated that desire as irrelevant. That answer settled into the room. Roas concluded the debriefing with a revision order. Future field exercises on hostile worlds would change. Shelter loss would be assumed. Forecast failure would be assumed. Plans would be evaluated based on their effectiveness in adapting after collapse, not before. Human cadets would no longer be segregated for endurance observation. They would be integrated as baseline references for failure state function. After the session, Roas found Mason and Luke outside the hall. They stood near a railing overlooking the training grounds, quiet as ever. I owe both of you an apology, Roas confessed. Luke offered a slight shrug, remarking, storms occur. Mason affirmed, individuals either gain insight or they don't. Roas managed a faint, weary grin. I did learn, he admitted. After a brief pause, he added, I won't make light of it again. Luke regarded him for a moment and simply said, good. Several weeks later, Field Exercise 12 became compulsory material, not due to the tempest, but because of the way it was handled. Cadets discovered that resilience wasn't gauged by mere hours endured in perfect circumstances. Rather, it was determined by choices made when surroundings eliminated solace, refuge, and assurance. The Academy refrained from glorifying humans as indestructible. Instead, it pursued a more challenging objective: It began instructing others on how to persevere similarly. Kellen Roas revised his teaching materials. He removed the slide previously displaying human endurance myth and substituted it with a concise statement. Endurance is what persists when strategies falter. On Kestrel 4, the gales persisted, as they always had. However, the Academy no longer dispatched cadets there to evaluate shelters. Instead, they were sent to ascertain if they would continue advancing when all other supports vanished. And no instructor ever chuckled again when the subject of humans arose.